At 22:14 on the night of July 3, 1942, a lone British SAS raider moved across the hard-packed north of Jallow Oasis, 20 miles short of the German airfield his patrol had been tasked to eliminate. The operation had not begun as a solo mission. It had started with a 4-vehicle LRDG insertion, a 12-man team, and a timetable built around coordinated demolition on multiple points of the airfield perimeter. But navigation errors in the dark had separated the convoy. One Chevrolet truck struck a concealed drainage ditch and blew its front axle. Another took sustained machine gun fire from a roving Luftwaffe security patrol while attempting to bypass a wadi. The third bogged so deeply in soft ground the men stripped it of explosives before abandoning it. Hours later, when the remaining vehicle realized it was alone and already behind schedule, the patrol commander made the call to withdraw to the rendezvous point. The raider now moving toward the objective hadn't received that order. His radio had been damaged during the earlier engagement. As far as he knew, the operation was still active, the timetable still valid, and the airfield needed to be struck before dawn reset the German security cycle. He carried what he could strip from the last vehicle: 2 satchel charges with time pencils, a set of thermite cans meant for engine blocks, a gammon bomb improvised from spare gelignite, and enough water for perhaps another 6 hours of movement. Intelligence had marked the target as a forward repair site for Ju-87s and Ju-88s operating out of Martuba, with approximately a company of Luftwaffe ground troops, 2 motorized patrol sections, and a layered perimeter of trip flares, wire and irregularly spaced guard posts. No part of the base was considered penetrable by a single man. Standard doctrine assumed a coordinated strike with vehicles and suppressive fire, not a silent approach by one demolitions-trained corporal moving on foot. No one in command believed any member of the patrol was still attempting the mission. No one on the German side believed the earlier skirmish had left a British raider alive. In practical terms, the only person aware that the attack had not yet failed was the man now closing distance on an airfield prepared to repel exactly the kind of infiltration he was about to attempt. By mid-1942, the Special Air Service was still an organization most senior British commanders barely understood and many distrusted. It had originated less than a year earlier as a small raiding group under David Stirling, built from volunteers who had been told that the standard infantry approach to North Africa, columns of vehicles advancing by daylight, was never going to neutralize the dispersed German air power crippling 8th Army supply lines. The SAS operated on the margins of doctrine. Small teams inserted deep behind Axis lines, using LRDG navigators to move cross-country at night, and attacking targets that conventional units were not structured to reach. Their core mission was simple on paper: destroy aircraft on the ground. In practice, it meant approaching heavily defended airfields equipped with bomb racks, repair shops, fuel depots, and security detachments specifically trained to combat infiltration. German commanders had adapted quickly. After the early SAS successes at Ajdabiya, Gazala, and Sirte, where dozens of aircraft were destroyed in a handful of nights, Luftwaffe ground units began reorganizing their perimeters. They added overlapping arcs of machine gun fire, buried tripwires in irregular patterns, assigned patrols to walk the airfield edges at unpredictable intervals, and installed makeshift early warning posts near the runways. What had once been relatively vulnerable targets were, by July 1942, hardened positions with disciplined guards who expected nighttime raiders. Intelligence briefings circulated through 8th Army warning that infiltration attempts against German forward airfields were now likely to encounter rapid reaction teams, prepositioned flares, mobile searchlights, and even decoy quiet zones meant to trap saboteurs. The British solution remained unchanged: send men trained to work around those problems instead of through them. The raider now moving toward the target had been part of that adaptation cycle. He had joined the SAS only months earlier, selected not for his rank. He remained a corporal despite multiple recommendations, but for his ability to handle demolitions under pressure and work independently when communication collapsed. His training had been minimal by later standards: instruction in time pencils, gelignite placement, silent movement, and coordinated multi-point sabotage. He had practiced planting charges on derelict vehicles in the desert, learned how to move with LRDG trucks without leaving a track profile recognizable to Italian aerial observers, and memorized the standard runway layouts used by German engineers. He understood how to identify which aircraft were serviceable and which were decoys, where the fuel drums were stored, and how to neutralize an engine block with a single well-placed thermite can. What made the coming infiltration uniquely difficult was not his lack of support but the nature of the target itself. The airfield north of Jallow was not a permanent base like Martuba or Tmimi. It was a forward operating strip built to service aircraft conducting sortie-intensive operations across the Cyrenaican front. Temporary by design, these forward strips changed quickly, expanding or contracting depending on supply status, recent attacks and Luftwaffe needs. Conventional mapping lagged behind reality by weeks. Aerial photos taken days earlier showed an estimated 12 to 15 aircraft, but reconnaissance had warned that reinforcements could push that number higher. The field was expected to include several Ju-87 Stukas in rotation, plus maintenance crews working through the night to keep them flying. Every one of those aircraft, engines intact, represented dive bombing capability against the British front line. In a normal SAS raid, the corporal would have been one of several raiders responsible for placing charges, with covering fire, backup demolitions and multiple escape routes. But on this night the operational framework had collapsed. He was out of communication, unaware that the patrol commander had aborted. The withdrawal order never reached him. His last confirmed directive, delivered before the convoy split, was blunt: reach the airfield perimeter, assess aircraft positions and destroy as many as possible before first light. Without knowing it, he was now executing that mission as if the original timetable still applied. He paused twice during the approach to reassess his bearings using the faint outline of the ridge features behind the target area. He carried no detailed map of the airfield interior, only a memorized layout based on aerial reconnaissance and standard Luftwaffe field construction practices. He knew the common pattern: fuel drums stored in shallow pits shielded by sand berms, repair tents away from blast lines, aircraft in 2 rows facing into the wind, guard posts positioned near the main taxiway intersection. He also knew that if any of the airfield's mobile patrols drifted outside their usual arcs, or if one guard post had an extra man awake and alert, the entire infiltration would end before he placed the first charge. He continued forward because the mission profile he understood demanded he do so. Because every hour the airfield stayed operational meant German aircraft lifting off and striking British armor units trying to hold their lines farther west. Because SAS doctrine did not include withdrawing from a viable target unless ordered. And because, at that moment, he believed he was still part of a coordinated assault, not the last man moving toward an objective most officers would have written off as lost. The target itself had been flagged repeatedly in 8th Army reports as a priority strike, not because of its size but because of the pattern of sorties traced back to it during the previous 10 days. Signals intelligence from intercept operators at Siwa had logged an uptick in coded transmissions consistent with forward staging for dive bomber operations. Aerial observers reported that several Stukas operating in the Gazala battle space were refueling and rearming at temporary strips rather than flying all the way back to the larger bases on the coast. The forward strip north of Jallo, though crude, sat at a tactically advantageous point, close enough to the front to shorten turnaround time, far enough inland to reduce the odds of being hit by routine RAF patrols. The field handled small numbers of aircraft at once, but those aircraft were precisely the ones hurting British armor and supply convoys. A single raiding team had the potential to cripple its function for days. The mission brief the corporal had received before insertion was direct. Satellite imagery did not exist, but recent aerial reconnaissance had mapped the approximate boundaries of the strip. A single packed earth runway roughly 850 yards long, 2 lateral taxiways, a cluster of canvas maintenance shelters, 2 auxiliary storage revetments previously used for spare bombs, and a defensive perimeter of shallow trenches and wire. The runway itself was serviceable but rough, used primarily for staging and emergency repairs rather than full-scale operations. What made the airfield dangerous was not its infrastructure but the presence of veteran Luftwaffe ground crews who had already survived multiple SAS-style attacks. Intelligence warned that these men were disciplined, quick to react, and had set up illumination flares and ad hoc tripwire positions along predictable approach vectors. The assault plan crafted before departure called for a synchronized 4-vehicle approach. 2 trucks would split to the north and place charges on fuel dumps and aircraft engines. The remaining 2 would attack from the west, using the noise and confusion to collapse the airfield's response time. All 4 teams were supposed to plant charges within a narrow window, then withdraw before the Germans could coordinate their counter-reaction. The corporal had originally been assigned to the Northern Demolition Detail, working alongside 2 other raiders experienced in rapid charge placement. He was not meant to scout alone, bypass patrols alone, or execute multiple objectives alone. But the plan assumed reliable navigation, intact vehicles, and preferably an extraction window less chaotic than the one he was now facing. The airfield was not an abstract target to him. He had seen firsthand the results of its operations, burned out British tanks that had taken Stuka hits, ambulances caught in strafing runs, and forward supply echelons forced to disperse because the Luftwaffe had shortened its turnaround time. He had listened to gunners describe how Stukas coming from the Jallow Strip were arriving in tighter intervals than expected, hitting the same grid squares multiple times before RAF fighters could intercept. Destroying aircraft on the ground was not a symbolic gesture, it altered the tempo of battle. Every Stuka taken out at the source reduced the pressure on British ground forces that next morning. He also understood that the Germans were not complacent. Reports from previous raids had noted an increased use of deception. Mock aircraft parked near the perimeter to draw charges, shallow pits filled with flammable waste meant to mimic fuel storage, even false tire tracks dragged behind vehicles to confuse infiltration timing. Guards rotated through posts irregularly, with no predictable pattern. Some nights they used lanterns for patrols, other nights nothing at all. The complexity of these defenses meant that even with a full SAS team, success was not guaranteed. With one man approaching the perimeter, the margin for error narrowed to practically zero. His memory of the airfield layout came entirely from briefings and practical experience on other raids. He knew that the Stukas would be arranged nose first into the wind, likely in 2 staggered rows. He knew the fuel drums would be stored behind sand berms to limit blast spread, but that the berms would also conceal guards. He knew that if the Germans had detected the earlier firefight with his patrol's split vehicles, they might have shifted sentries or doubled up on the main access path. He also knew that Luftwaffe ground troops sometimes slept beside their aircraft during vulnerable periods. Any movement wrong by 30 yards, any misjudged shadow or misplaced footstep, would place him directly in a guard's line of sight. Still, none of that changed the fundamental mission profile he carried in his head. Approach silently, identify serviceable aircraft, plant thermite charges on engine blocks, set time pencils for staggered detonation, and exploit the confusion for withdrawal. That was the doctrine, refined through trial, error, and the unfortunate losses of men who had tried shortcuts. The corporal respected that doctrine. It had kept him alive on previous operations and shaped how he framed every step now. He did not consider abandoning the mission because SAS training at the time emphasized self-reliance to an extreme degree. Once a raider committed to the objective and no explicit abort order was received, he acted on the assumption that the success of the operation might depend entirely on him. In the absence of communication and without knowledge of the patrol commander's withdrawal, he treated the situation as a contingency the manuals didn't cover but his instincts did. The target still stood, the window of opportunity still existed, and the consequences of inaction still outweighed the personal risk. 20 miles stood between him and the airfield, but to him the operation had not changed. Only the size of the team had. The infiltration began long before the corporal reached visible elements of the airfield. Standard SAS procedure dictated that raiders halt at least 1 kilometer short of a target to conduct an initial assessment of movement patterns, guard activity, and any deviations from reconnaissance expectations. But tonight there were no other raiders to halt with, no shared observations whispered between men scanning the perimeter from multiple angles. The corporal was forced to conduct his own layered reconnaissance on the move, breaking every 100 yards to lie flat, listen, and evaluate whether the sounds he heard were ambient or mechanical. The Luftwaffe frequently ran small generators late into the night to power maintenance lamps and battery chargers. Their tone carried differently depending on humidity, wind direction, and distance. He listened for that tone and caught faint, intermittent traces, confirmation he was still oriented correctly despite the loss of the convoy. He advanced along a shallow depression that intelligence had marked as one of the safer approach vectors. In reality, safer meant only that Italian engineers had not fully graded it when they expanded the landing strip. Depressions offered cover but also disrupted sound, making it harder to determine if guards were patrolling above the lip. A misjudged descent would silhouette him against the horizon if any watchman happened to glance in his direction. He worked forward in a pattern drilled into SAS recruits. Crawl, halt, listen. Crawl, halt, listen. Every pause had a purpose. He used the halts to test the ground with his fingertips, feeling for irregularities that might indicate tripwires, buried stakes, or churned soil, signatures of recently adjusted defensive positions. The deeper he pushed, the more he had to rely on accumulated field craft. Luftwaffe security elements did not patrol like Italian sentries or Afrika Korps infantry. Their spacing tended to be more disciplined, their rotations less predictable, and their reactions faster because they had already endured raids where seconds mattered. The corporal assumed that at least one patrol would be walking the perimeter in a staggered V formation. 1 man forward, 2 trailing at slight offsets to cover blind angles. That formation was particularly effective against single infiltrators because any sound or shadow missed by the point man could still be picked up by the flanking pair. Whether such a patrol was active tonight he did not know. The only way to find out was to continue forward until either he saw them or they saw him. Midway through the approach, he encountered German tire tracks, fresh, compressed into the hardpack without the scouring that wind usually left after several hours. He crouched and measured the spacing with his palm. Truck, possibly a fuel lorry heading outward. That meant the airfield was being resupplied at night, an indicator of operational urgency. It also meant increased foot movement around the main taxiway and revetments. On a normal raid, the team would split to circumvent those high-traffic areas. Alone, he had no choice but to select a vector that reduced exposure without introducing unpredictability. He cut slightly west of his original path, using a line of shallow berms, likely the remnants of earlier construction spoil, to conceal lateral movement. He advanced only when ambient noise rose, a distant aircraft engine turning over for maintenance, the metallic rhythm of tools striking engine cowlings, the barked orders of ground crew coordinating repairs. When he closed within 300 yards of the outer perimeter, he switched from movement to observation. The German field security doctrine included the practice of placing illumination trip flares near likely infiltration routes. These devices, often improvised from signal flares and tent pegs, were nearly invisible until activated. Their light could expose a raider completely, ruining any chance of reaching the target. The corporal searched for subtle indicators: slightly darker soil where a peg had been driven, faint metallic glint from a flare head half buried in loose dirt, or unnatural straight lines where wire lay concealed. He found 2 such devices within a 20-yard stretch and marked them mentally, adjusting his route to avoid both. That adjustment cost valuable time, but rushing was more dangerous than waiting. He also identified 2 guard posts, neither in the positions predicted by reconnaissance. Each post consisted of a shallow trench with a sandbagged lip and a single rifleman facing outward. Their spacing suggested a shift in German security patterns, perhaps implemented after detecting British movement earlier that evening. The corporal noted their arcs of fire and the dead ground between them. The dead ground, a triangle-shaped zone where neither guard had line of sight, became the corridor he would use. But reaching it required crossing open ground for 15 yards without cover. Under normal circumstances, more men would synchronize their movements to divide attention. He had to time his advance precisely with whatever noise inside the airfield masked sound outside. He waited nearly 10 minutes for the opportunity. It came when ground crew began testing an engine. The engine whine rose sharply, vibrating through the dirt. As the sound peaked, he moved, not a sprint but a low, fast walk, keeping his profile below the berm line. He covered the 15 yards, dropped into the dead ground and froze. Neither guard reacted. The engine test drowned his footfall completely. From this new vantage he could see the outer structures of the airfield more clearly. Canvas maintenance shelters stood in 2 staggered rows. Several aircraft shapes were visible under them, dark fuselages, tail fins outlined by faint interior light. Beyond them were the fuel drums he had been briefed about, stacked near a shallow pit. More important than any of this was the realization that the Germans had repositioned their primary reaction squad. The expected location near the southeastern corner was empty, replaced by stacked crates and a tarp. That meant the reaction squad was somewhere else, likely closer to the center of the field or nearer the runways. The corporal scanned the area, searching for movement, shadows, or silhouettes. He spotted a trio of soldiers smoking near a tent, their rifles leaning against a support pole. That cluster, not the shift in guard posts, suggested the new reaction staging point. He recalculated his options. His primary objective remained the aircraft. But if the reaction squad was closer to the center, planting charges on multiple aircraft before alarms sounded was less feasible. He had to prioritize targets that would disrupt flight operations most effectively: aircraft in active service, fuel stores, or critical maintenance equipment. The thermite cans in his pack were designed precisely for this. Small, silent once placed, devastating when ignited. His satchel charges with time pencils could be set to detonate in a staggered sequence, stretching German response time and creating confusion long enough for him to escape. Before proceeding, he conducted one final assessment of the perimeter. He watched each guard for a full rotation of their scanning patterns, how long they paused, how quickly they lifted their rifles, how often they shifted footing. He analyzed the rhythm of noise within the field: hammer strikes, shouted commands, intermittent bursts of generator hum. He charted these as cover points for movement, waiting for loud peaks to mask steps. Once satisfied he had the minimum actionable intelligence needed, he began the final leg of the infiltration. There were no more terrain features to rely on. He was now approaching the operational zone of the target itself, where any mistake would betray him instantly. The airfield was awake, functioning, and manned by personnel who had survived enough raids to assume another might come. Yet none of them knew that this time, the attack would consist of exactly one man moving silently along the fringe of their defenses, carrying enough explosives to destroy half their operational capacity if he placed them correctly. The infiltration phase had reached its point of no return. Every decision that followed would happen inside the envelope of German detection, exactly where SAS doctrine expected small teams to operate, but never a single raider alone. Closing the final 200 yards demanded a different pattern of movement entirely. Up to that point, the corporal had relied on terrain, depressions, timing, and the predictable blind spots common around forward operating strips. Now he was within the zone where noise discipline alone would not guarantee survival. Luftwaffe ground personnel were accustomed to hearing tools drop, fuel drums slide, and boots scuff on packed earth. But they were equally conditioned to notice anomalous sounds, footsteps that didn't match the cadence of German drill, the metallic click of foreign gear, or the unfamiliar friction of British webbing. The corporal adjusted his entire load. He redistributed the thermite cans so they sat tight against his ribs, wrapped the metal ends of the time pencils in cloth to eliminate accidental tapping, and ensured the gammon bomb was secure enough not to roll when he crouched. He chose his first movement window when a group of mechanics dragged a tool cart across the taxiway. The wheels rattled loudly against uneven ground, giving him nearly 8 seconds of massed sound. In that interval, he advanced 30 yards and dropped behind a low sand berm at the edge of an auxiliary taxi path. From this closer angle, he could now hear the low voices of ground crew as they worked under partially lit shelters. The Germans were conducting engine checks on at least 2 aircraft. The familiar rhythm of cowling clamps being tightened and loosened told him the team was preparing one machine for readiness testing. That particular aircraft, likely a Ju-87, would be one of his primary targets. Destroying it would have both tactical and psychological effect. Maintenance crews hated losing aircraft they had spent hours repairing. He scanned the pattern of shadows beneath the canvas shelters. Aircraft silhouettes were unmistakable. The jut of landing struts, the angled fins, and the raised hoods of engine access panels. But which planes were fully operational? He looked for indicators: ground crew clustered in numbers around one airframe, an engine cowling removed entirely, a fuel line snaked toward a drum, or a ladder positioned under a cockpit, signs that maintenance was active and the aircraft likely to launch that morning. He counted at least 4 serviceable planes in immediate view, possibly more deeper inside the main cluster. He did not need to destroy all of them to cripple the base. 2 or 3 well-placed thermite charges in key engines could effectively shut down sortie cycles for a full day. His next obstacle was a guard moving between the revetments. The guard carried a rifle slung incorrectly, a detail the corporal noted because poorly slung rifles tended to clatter against metal if a soldier turned sharply. That meant the guard was inexperienced or complacent. Either scenario worked to the corporal's advantage, but he did not underestimate the man. Inexperienced guards often compensated with unpredictability, pausing at odd intervals or reversing direction without warning. The corporal timed the man's walk, a 20-step pattern, pivot, 15-step return, pause near the corner of a canvas shelter. He watched this full cycle twice. Only after confirming its stability did he prepare to cross the guard's path during the pivot phase, when the man's weapon swung across his back and temporarily interfered with his peripheral vision. He moved again, hugging the back of a row of fuel drums. He knew the risk of being caught near fuel. If he startled a soldier and gunfire erupted, a stray round striking a drum could ignite the area, trapping him between advancing Germans and a wall of flame. But those drums also provided the only reliable cover tall enough to break his silhouette as he advanced deeper into the operational zone. He crouched low, feeling the vibrations of the airfield more distinctly now, the thump of a mallet adjusting a control surface, the muted thud of boots inside a tent, the metallic creak of wing struts under pressure. Every sound formed the backdrop of a functioning military installation that was not expecting a British raider inside its perimeter. Near the center of the field, he found the first opportunity to plant a charge. A maintenance shelter partially blocked the view of 2 guards whose arcs overlapped most of the runway edge. Beneath this shelter sat a Stuka with its engine cowling open, mechanics having stepped away briefly, likely to retrieve parts. The corporal counted their positions. 3 men at a distance engaged in loud discussion near a table of tools, 1 man inside a tent, none with line of sight to the engine block. This was the window he needed. He slid forward, removed the thermite can, and placed it in the cradle of the engine compartment, ensuring the ignition strip was oriented downward where it would burn through the crankcase with maximum effect. He double-checked the placement without hesitation. Improper positioning would waste the charge entirely. He withdrew the moment the mechanics began to return, using their own footsteps and conversation to mask his retreat. From there he began mapping his next targets. The second aircraft required different timing. 2 mechanics were still working on it, their lantern illuminating a faint arc of light that would expose him instantly if he approached from the wrong angle. He observed them for nearly 5 minutes, cataloging their behavior, how often they stepped around the nose where they set down their tools, and in which direction they tended to look while speaking. When one left to fetch a replacement part and the remaining mechanic bent sideways under the wing, the corporal closed the distance, placed a thermite can on the rear bank of the engine assembly, and backed out before the man straightened. 2 aircraft down. Enough to compromise morning operations but not enough to justify retreat. He still had satchel charges and time pencils, and he intended to use them for maximum airfield disruption. Aircraft damage was valuable, but fuel destruction had far broader tactical effect. A depleted dump could cripple operations for days. But fuel dumps were also the most heavily monitored parts of forward airfields. He approached the nearest berm slowly, stopping 3 separate times when he detected voices shifting on the far side. He crawled up the backside of the berm, moving only when noise levels rose from interior activity. Upon reaching the crest, he assessed the storage pit. 3 dozen drums stacked in 2 layers with a guard sitting on a crate beside them, rubbing his eyes. The guard was sleepy, inattentive, but awake enough to ruin everything. The corporal evaluated alternate approaches but found none workable. He marked the site mentally as a potential target only if time allowed after hitting his primary objectives. He continued deeper, performing incremental reconnaissance as he went. He identified a key maintenance tent with diagnostic equipment, a generator susceptible to disabling and several racks of spare parts. Each offered opportunities to inflict long-term logistical damage, but only if approached with precision. Placing charges on aircraft was straightforward. Sabotage of infrastructure required timing and stealth beyond what he could guarantee alone. Still, he kept these options in reserve. At minimum, he would note their locations for the after-action report, assuming he survived long enough to deliver one. The final phase of the infiltration was now underway. He was inside the beating heart of the airfield. Every movement, every placement, every choice had immediate consequence. The Germans were only a few errors away from discovering a lone SAS raider operating inside their most protected zone, and once they understood that, their reaction would be swift and uncompromising. The corporal understood this as well as any man who had lived through previous raids. But as long as he matched his timing to theirs, exploited their noise patterns and maintained absolute discipline in his movements, the next few minutes would determine whether the airfield functioned at dawn, or whether it turned into a debris field lit by burning Stukas. The window to execute the actual demolition sequence began when the corporal confirmed that at least 2 mechanics had moved to the far side of the maintenance line, leaving several aircraft momentarily unattended. He had already placed 2 thermite cans, both positioned accurately enough to disable engines beyond repair when they activated. But the destruction of aircraft alone would not fulfill the mission's intention. The briefings emphasized that knocking out forward staging capability required synchronized detonations that overwhelmed response units before they could form a coherent perimeter. To achieve that effect alone, the corporal needed to use his remaining explosives, the satchel charges and gammon bomb, with a level of precision usually distributed among multiple raiders. He evaluated target hierarchy. The highest value asset after the aircraft themselves was the generator cluster that powered maintenance lamps, battery chargers and radio link stations. A functional generator allowed ground crews to coordinate emergency repairs, bring searchlights online, and orient guards toward intruders. Neutralizing that generator would immediately degrade German situational awareness. However, the generator was partially exposed, and a detonation there would alert every guard within seconds. The corporal needed that destruction to coincide with the other major blasts, creating confusion so widespread that the reaction squad wouldn't know which sector to address first. He moved closer to the generator by navigating behind a row of stacked crates. These crates, likely holding spare parts or ordnance, formed a narrow passage that shielded him from the view of an approaching guard. The corporal paused, pressed his ear toward the nearest crate, and listened for vibration. Generators transmitted steady mechanical pulses through anything touching the ground. The pulse was detectable. The generator was within effective range of his satchel charge. The satchel charge required accurate timing. Time pencils were notoriously unreliable in extreme heat, but the corporal compensated by carrying multiple pencils and selecting two with overlapping delay windows. He inserted the first pencil into the charge, then the second at a slightly different angle, ensuring that if one failed, the other would ignite within a tolerable margin. He then placed the satchel on the left side of the generator's base assembly, where the explosive force would rupture the crank housing and disable the flywheel. Without this generator, the Germans would have to rely on handheld lamps. Slower, dimmer, and easier to evade. Next came the more dangerous portion of the sabotage, the aircraft position deepest inside the revetments. These revetments were built from earth and sandbags, sloped inward to deflect bomb fragments and minimize collateral fire. But their design also narrowed movement paths, forcing anyone approaching the aircraft to walk in a corridor where shadows fell unpredictably. The corporal studied the revetment entrance for a full minute, waiting for the mechanics inside to exit. When the two men stepped out carrying tools, speaking loudly to each other, he slipped behind them just as they passed around the corner of the shelter. Inside the revetment he found a third aircraft, possibly serviceable. The canopy was open and a toolbox sat on the ground near the wing root, evidence that the aircraft was mid-maintenance and targeted for operational readiness. He assessed the engine, intact. Fuel line, connected. Propeller, locked into test position. This was a high-priority strike. Instead of using thermite, he opted for a time pencil charge on the airframe. Thermite burned locally, but a satchel charge would create a multi-vector blast that compromised wing spars and structural integrity. He placed the satchel against the engine mount frame, securing it with strips of torn cloth to prevent shifting. Then he inserted two more time pencils, one primary, one redundant. He set the shortest delay on this charge to ensure that detonations would begin here, forcing German attention away from the outer shelters where the thermite cans would ignite shortly after. The corporal then withdrew, retracing his route down the revetment corridor. His movements were timed to coincide with the noise of the mechanics returning to the aircraft he had sabotaged. He passed within 2 yards of one of them, separated only by canvas. The man complained aloud about missing wrench sizes. The corporal stayed perfectly still until the mechanic moved deeper inside the revetment, then resumed his exit. Now he had to deal with the fuel drums. Destroying fuel was dangerous because it attracted instant attention. But destroying the right drums created a cascading effect. Fire, smoke, panic, and the potential ignition of additional stores. The corporal weighed the risk. If he could time the fuel destruction to coincide with the generator blast and the first engine charge, the Germans would be overwhelmed. He advanced toward the berm, crawled up the same path he had used earlier, and observed the guard still sitting on the crate. The guard had grown even more complacent, slumping slightly with his rifle resting loosely across his lap. That gave the corporal a narrow, exploitable window. He slid to the edge of the berm, reached into his pack and retrieved the gammon bomb, a hasty but effective device designed precisely for situations like this. He removed the safety plug, held the bomb with the grip of someone who had used them before, and rolled it down the incline so it would settle against the lowest drum in the stack. The weight and angle would ensure maximum blast concentration against the weakest point of the cluster. This charge needed no time pencil. It would be triggered by the concussion wave from the satchel charges already placed inside the airfield. The corporal backed down the berm carefully and resumed movement toward his escape vector. But he wasn't finished. One final target remained, a communications tent used for coordinating maintenance schedules and transmitting readiness reports back to higher German commands. Destroying that tent would break their ability to coordinate effectively under attack. He approached through the rear, where stacked equipment crates formed a partial blind spot. He cut a narrow slit in the tent's lower canvas wall, silent and precise, and slipped a thermite can inside, placing it against a rack of maintenance records and radio spares. When ignited, thermite would burn through everything without producing the same immediate explosive signature as a satchel charge. It would create chaos without alerting guards instantly. With all charges planted, the corporal began his exit sequence. He moved in reverse order of sabotage, crossing each zone at the moments when guards were least likely to notice his silhouette. As he retreated toward the dead ground between the two guard posts, he saw the first sign that his timing was accurate, a faint spark of ignition in the revetment he had sabotaged. The thermite can in the Stuka engine block caught first, burning white-hot, and within seconds the engine housing began to deform. A mechanic shouted something unintelligible. Another man ran toward the plane, but by the time he arrived, the second thermite charge had ignited on the next aircraft. Confusion built rapidly. Then the first satchel detonated. The explosion was sharp and violent, shaking the generator cluster and throwing debris across the central maintenance zone. Lights flickered and died instantly. The entire airfield plunged into partial darkness. Mechanics screamed. A guard blew a whistle. Men ran in multiple directions, some toward the noise, some away from it. There was no cohesion, exactly what the corporal needed. Seconds later, the charge in the revetment detonated, blowing structural components across the runway and destroying the third aircraft in a burst of fragmented steel and wood. A moment later, the gammon bomb under the fuel drums triggered from the concussion wave. The drums ruptured simultaneously, fuel spraying upward and igniting in a rising column of fire that illuminated the entire northern edge of the airfield. The Germans were overwhelmed instantly. Searchlights tried to activate but failed because of the destroyed generator. Guards shouted conflicting orders. The reaction squad, now disoriented, ran toward the wrong sector. Aircraft crews attempted to salvage equipment but were met with blast waves and shrapnel. The corporal's infiltration had turned into a coordinated strike, executed entirely by one man. He was already well past the outer perimeter when the final secondary explosions erupted behind him. The airfield wasn't simply damaged. It was non-operational. Aircraft, fuel, generators, communications, destroyed in one sequence. The raid had succeeded, but the corporal still had to escape. And now every German soldier in the vicinity knew something catastrophic had occurred inside their perimeter. All that remained for the corporal was the most difficult phase of the mission, retreating 20 miles through territory where the Germans would now search aggressively for any sign of the saboteur. The corporal began his withdrawal before the major detonations finished echoing across the field. SAS doctrine emphasized that raiders must never remain to observe damage when operating alone. Survival depended on maximizing the window between initial confusion and organized response. He moved in a controlled retreat, retracing part of his infiltration route but adjusting vectors whenever the pattern of German movement forced deviation. His first priority was to clear the outer perimeter before the reaction squad established a coherent search net. He used the disturbance caused by the generator blast to mask his exit from the maintenance cluster, slipping past the second guard post while its riflemen sprinted toward the fuel fire, shouting warnings in rapid, clipped German. Once clear of the revetments, he kept low and crossed the 15-yard open section he had used earlier, waiting for the roar of secondary explosions to mask his steps. Shrapnel whistled overhead as a fuel drum ruptured behind him, scattering metal fragments across the perimeter. The corporal remained calm. He had anticipated the blast radius and chosen an escape line outside of it. He reached the shallow depression he had used for initial observation and dropped into it, allowing the elevated berms to conceal him from guards now rushing to reinforce the compromised sectors. Within minutes of the first explosions, German forces shifted from confusion to structured reaction. Luftwaffe NCOs established ad hoc rally points around the runway's midpoint, while an officer assembled a 10-man search team armed with rifles and lanterns. These were not random movements. The Germans followed counter-sabotage protocols developed after previous SAS attacks. Establish a perimeter gate, deploy search teams in fan-shaped patterns, secure fuel and ordnance, and verify that no raider remained on site. The corporal anticipated this and worked to stay ahead of their expanding arcs. He advanced steadily through the shallow depression until he reached its far end, where the terrain rose into uneven hardpack. This was the most dangerous portion of the retreat, transitioning from protected ground into open desert while the airfield behind him fully mobilized. He paused briefly, listening for changes in enemy movement. He could hear Germans shouting, the metallic rattling of equipment being gathered, and the distant churn of an engine, likely a light truck being prepared for deployment. The corporal deduced that the Luftwaffe would not pursue in force immediately. They would first confirm that no raider remained within their perimeter. That gave him a narrow window, 20 minutes at most, before pursuit began in earnest. He used that window to create distance. He selected his heading based on terrain features memorized during the approach, a line of low ridges that would shield him from direct observation if searchlights or vehicle lamps probed outward. He moved in fast, controlled strides, periodically dropping to the ground whenever he heard metallic clatter that suggested German troops climbing guard platforms or repositioning. The goal was not speed alone. It was stealth combined with predictable bursts of movement timed to enemy noise. 10 minutes into his withdrawal, the airfield behind him erupted into organized chaos. German officers realized the scale of the damage. Multiple aircraft destroyed, the generator cluster disabled, communications gear burning, and fuel drums detonated in secondary waves. The scene mirrored past SAS raids, except intelligence reports later noted that the Germans were unable to determine how many raiders had attacked. The corporal's precisely staggered charges mimicked the signature of a multi-man team. This misdirection was critical. Believing a full squad was involved, German patrols spread out more widely, diluting their search concentration. Within the next phase, the Germans activated the field's vehicle assets, 2 Kübelwagens and a light truck. These vehicles began sweeping outward in slow, methodical arcs. Their search pattern matched established Luftwaffe doctrine. Begin with a 300-yard radius, sweep clockwise, then expand to 600 yards, focusing on terrain depressions and likely infiltration routes. The corporal had studied these patterns during training and knew exactly where their blind spots would form. Vehicle lamps created glare that prevented drivers from seeing beyond their own illumination, and the noise of their engines masked subtle movements directly to their flanks. He angled his retreat to stay perpendicular to their arcs. Several times, he heard the rumble of engines pass within 80 yards of his position. Twice, he lay completely flat as a Kübelwagen lamp swept across a ridge above him, illuminating the slope but not the ground directly behind it. German troops dismounted frequently, scanning the area on foot. Their boots struck the ground in sharp, distinct rhythms, contrasting with the corporal's soft tread. He maintained absolute silence, breathing shallowly, waiting for each search team to move before resuming his advance. As he pressed deeper into the open desert, the airfield's illumination dimmed behind him. Flames from destroyed aircraft and burning fuel provided intermittent flashes of orange light, but the corporal moved quickly enough that he soon merged into darkness beyond the Germans' effective search boundary. The risk was still high. Search teams would expand outward until the German commander became convinced the raiders had retreated too far to catch before daylight. He knew the next phase of pursuit would involve radio coordination. Even with their communications tent destroyed, the Luftwaffe still had backup sets in vehicles. They would likely broadcast alerts to nearby Italian or German patrol posts, ordering them to watch for British saboteurs fleeing west or southwest. He anticipated these calls and adjusted his escape route accordingly. Instead of heading directly toward the LRDG rendezvous point, he adopted an oblique angle that would allow him to reorient later without crossing predictable intercept lines. At approximately 1 mile from the airfield, he stopped for the first time since the detonations. This stop was not rest, it was a calculated evaluation point. SAS training stressed that withdrawal must never be linear. Pursuers expected straight routes. The corporal therefore executed a dogleg maneuver, shifting course 35 degrees to his right for several hundred yards, then swinging back to his original vector only when he reached terrain with natural cover. This maneuver broke any linear track he might have left on areas where the hardpack was soft enough to register faint impressions. Behind him, searchlights swept in wide arcs, and the faint glow of burning aircraft illuminated drifting clouds of smoke. He could hear distant shouts, German teams arguing, miscommunicating, struggling to coordinate in the dark without the generator-powered lamps they depended on. The sabotage had done more than destroy material, it had cut the discipline out of the reaction cycle. Without clear communication and with critical infrastructure burning, the Luftwaffe's response devolved into disjointed actions that favored the corporal's escape. But he knew the pursuit wasn't over. As soon as dawn approached, German aircraft from other bases could sweep the area. And if desert patrol units, Italian or German, had received alerts, they would establish checkpoints along the most likely withdrawal routes. The corporal had to cross at least 10 miles before first light to minimize the risk of aerial detection. He began increasing his pace, shifting from stealth to sustained movement. He navigated by the faint silhouette of a ridge line he had identified before reaching the airfield. Each step was calculated to conserve energy while maintaining speed. He kept his canteen sealed, no water until he cleared the most dangerous zone. He moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who understood distance and geography not academically but through repeated experience. Pace count, terrain memory, drift compensation, and constant recalibration. Every mile he added increased his survival odds. Every minute that passed reduced the probability of capture. And the fire behind him, the destruction he had orchestrated alone, continued to draw German attention inward while he moved outward. The escape phase was far from complete, but the corporal had now crossed the threshold that separated raiding from evasion. The operation had transitioned into its final, most unforgiving phase, reaching friendly lines without being tracked, intercepted, or discovered by forces that would be searching for him until sunrise. 2 miles into the withdrawal, the corporal entered the phase of escape that SAS manuals described simply as open country evasion, a deceptively simple term for the most lethal segment of a raid. Behind him, the airfield still burned, producing intermittent flashes as detonated fuel pockets ignited secondary fires. German search teams had expanded outward in disordered but increasingly wide arcs. The corporal could no longer hear their individual shouts, but he recognized a deeper danger, the lull that signaled the transition from chaotic reaction to structured pursuit. Once the Luftwaffe officers finished their damage assessment, they would initiate coordinated search patterns using vehicles, dogs if available, and eventually aerial reconnaissance at first light. The corporal had to increase distance quickly enough that any widening search perimeter would fail to intersect his path. He moved into terrain that alternated between flat hardpack and shallow undulations carved by years of wind and runoff. These small rises and dips provided limited cover, but also carried the risk of funneling him into predictable routes. Pursuers often aimed for such terrain features because raiders subconsciously gravitated toward them for concealment. The corporal countered this by varying his movement profile. He crossed each undulation at an oblique angle rather than following its natural contour. This technique, taught during SAS training, minimized trackability and made it difficult for potential pursuit teams to reconstruct direction of travel. He paused only long enough to update his heading using the faint ridgeline he had identified earlier. This ridgeline was his anchor, but he could not follow it directly. Its crest would silhouette him against the coming dawn, making him visible for hundreds of yards. Instead, he parallel tracked the ridge, keeping just far enough downslope that the terrain masked his outline without sacrificing orientation. He advanced with long, steady strides, each step a deliberate allocation of energy. Water was limited, and he could not afford to lose speed later due to dehydration. He kept his breathing controlled, inhaling through his nose to reduce fatigue buildup, a technique learned from long marches during training. As he pushed farther, new threats developed. The corporal noticed intermittent flashes of light in the distance, vehicle lamps too far to be from the airfield guards. That meant at least one patrol from a nearby Italian outpost or Axis motorized detachment had been contacted by radio and was beginning to sweep outward from secondary positions. These patrols rarely coordinated well with Luftwaffe ground units, but they introduced random variables: roadblocks, dismounted teams probing drainage channels, and potentially an armored car capable of covering large distances rapidly. The corporal analyzed these lights and adjusted again, taking a shallow hook left to bypass a depression that might draw a patrol along its natural line. The greatest danger now was time. Dawn was less than 2 hours away. Once light broke across the desert, his silhouette, movement, and even faint track impressions would become visible from a distance that no infantryman could outrun. If any aircraft from Martuba or Ajdabiya launched early patrols, their elevation and vantage would reveal him immediately. He increased pace, shifting to a sustained near jog for short intervals, then dropping back to a brisk walk to avoid exhausting his leg muscles. The weight of his pack, now lighter without explosives, still pulled against his shoulders, but he redistributed the straps to reduce friction and maintain stride efficiency. He scanned constantly for terrain irregularities large enough to serve as temporary concealment if aircraft appeared: shallow wadis, low rises, or abandoned construction pits. He found 2 such features and memorized their locations in case he had to dive for cover. Aerial detection was nearly impossible to evade once spotted, but using terrain tactically could force aircraft to lose visual contact long enough for the corporal to slip into shadow or blend into harder ground. At approximately 4 miles out, he reached the first major danger point, the transitional zone where search teams, believing the saboteur may have fled toward British lines, would begin focusing their outward sweeps. Here, German doctrine tended to follow a predictable model: 2 vehicles establishing a search fence, driving parallel in wide arcs with mounted lights sweeping the terrain. Infantry teams would trail behind, spaced at irregular intervals, attempting to identify footprints or discarded equipment. The corporal listened for engines before cresting any rise and stayed low whenever he detected misaligned echoes, evidence of vehicles changing direction. He executed another dogleg maneuver, shifting right for nearly 300 yards, then angling back left to rejoin his previous bearing. This zigzag pattern, while longer in distance, prevented pursuit teams from using simple triangulation to estimate his path. If any Italian patrol followed tracks left earlier in softer ground, the dogleg would break their line, delaying or entirely defeating their pursuit. He continued pushing forward, muscles tightening from the sustained exertion, but adrenaline and training carried him through the fatigue. He rationed breaths, adjusting gait to limit oxygen consumption. His throat was dry, but he still resisted drinking. Water was a controlled asset, and dehydration was preferable to leaving himself without reserves before reaching the expected rendezvous. The corporal also understood the psychology of pursuit. The first hour was the most dangerous. Once the Germans believed they had lost the track, their pursuit intensity dipped, though never entirely ceased. Halfway through the 6th mile, the corporal's instincts confirmed what his ears had already suggested. German forces were widening their search pattern southward. He could hear faint echoes of shouted orders, likely officers redirecting teams based on partial reports. The corporal maintained speed and direction. Any deviation now risked increasing exposure or bending into an unpredictable trap. Too far left, he risked running into Italian motorized patrol routes. Too far right, he risked intersecting the natural gravitational pull of the Luftwaffe search arc. He remained centered on the safest vector, one that maximized terrain cover, minimized predictable movement, and brought him incrementally closer to his planned link-up. Near the 7th mile, he slowed at the edge of a shallow drainage cut. These cuts were double-edged. Good concealment, bad if enemy patrols walked along them due to the ease of tracking. He leaned in, examined the soil texture, and felt for moisture or irregularities. The ground was too soft. Tracks here would linger until daylight. He bypassed the cut entirely, staying on firmer ground where faint impressions would be erased more easily by wind or shifting sand. The sky behind him slowly began to lighten, a thin bluish band forming on the horizon. Dawn approached. The corporal recalculated. He needed at least 3 more miles before sunrise to put himself beyond the realistic pursuit radius of ground forces. Once the sun rose, aerial detection would become the primary threat, but only if German planes could be scrambled quickly enough to reach this zone in early light. That window was narrower than many assumed. Aircraft needed warm-up time, ground crew coordination, and takeoff clearance. With the airfield crippled, the probability of an immediate launch was low, but not zero because neighboring airfields could still respond. He increased pace again, transitioning into intervals of slow running mixed with fast walking. His joints protested, his shoulders burned, but he kept moving. He had already survived the most dangerous part, the airfield penetration and sabotage. Now survival depended on calculated persistence, a steady cadence, and the refusal to stop until the desert placed enough distance between him and the men who were searching for a saboteur they still believed was a full SAS team. The corporal pressed forward, knowing the final and most dangerous chapters of the escape. Sunrise, open visibility, heat exposure, and the last miles to the rendezvous were still ahead. Approaching the final miles, the corporal transitioned from evasion to controlled navigation. He no longer expected organized pursuit behind him. The Germans would now be focused on containing the damage, securing the wrecked airfield, and reporting losses to higher command. But isolated patrols or wandering reconnaissance elements could still compromise everything. He reduced his pace deliberately, not out of fatigue, but to lower the probability of exposing himself to unexpected observers in the shallow valleys ahead. Each movement was calculated. Short bursts of walking followed by halts where he scanned for dust signatures, engine echoes, or unnatural glints of metal. He used the rendezvous criteria exactly as briefed: a distinctive break in the ridge line, a dry wadi intersecting at a shallow angle, and a large boulder formation known to LRDG navigators. These features served as passive markers, visible without requiring any signal or light. As he approached the wadi, he descended cautiously into its basin, testing the soil for recent tracks. None appeared. That absence told him the patrol had either not yet arrived or had passed earlier and moved to a secondary standby point. He advanced another 100 yards before spotting what confirmed he was in the correct area. A single, faint tire impression from the type used by LRDG Chevrolets, wide, spaced tread, softer at the outer edges. It wasn't fresh, but it was recent enough to indicate he was closing in. He followed the wadi's bend, staying on firm ground to avoid leaving evidence of his route. When he reached the pre-briefed rock formation, he halted in a shadowed recess and listened for several minutes. The sound he needed eventually came, a muted engine rumble, throttled low, approaching from the west in short, controlled bursts. Only LRDG drivers used that rhythm. The corporal shifted position slightly so that he would be visible once the patrol cleared the nearest rise but still concealed if the approaching vehicle wasn't friendly. When the truck finally appeared, profile unmistakable against the ridge, the distinctive roofline, the stowed sand channels, he stepped out just far enough to signal without exposing his full silhouette. The truck braked, a commander leaned forward, and 2 armed men scanned the ridge behind him. The corporal didn't wave, didn't call out. SAS protocol dictated minimal exposure until recognition was confirmed. After a brief exchange of hand signals, the commander nodded. Only then did the corporal close the distance, climb into the rear of the truck and secure his gear. The vehicle turned immediately, accelerating into a navigation route designed to escape the area before enemy aircraft could begin broad daylight reconnaissance. No one asked questions, no one needed to. The corporal's condition, the blackened smoke on the horizon, and the absence of other raiders told the entire story. The mission was complete.